Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, for the 20th anniversary of Survivor, the Australian Outback, I decided to rewatch the season, and here I'm going to be talking about my detailed thoughts while rewatching it. And I've said this many times in the past. I mean, the Australian Outback is not my favorite season in the world. I don't particularly like it. It was on the bottom of my season rankings, and through rewatching this, nothing changed. I still find this the most boring season of the show. And people complain about seasons like Redemption Island and One World, but for me, this season, this post-merge is such a drag. It's so slow, and it's really the hardest slog of episodes to get through in the history of the show for me. Obviously there are great moments here and there, but most of the gameplay on the season is also pretty slow, and so much of the focus on the season is put into the survival elements, which is something that I personally just find boring. I also don't find the cast the most riveting in the world. There's obviously some highlights like Colby, Tina, and Jerry. We also have a decent amount of people who don't bring much to the table. Such as Nick and Amber, who both make pretty deep runs into the season. But just like my other retrospectives I do like this, we're going to be going through episode by episode. So let's start off with the premiere, which for me was fine. This episode for me encompasses my entire thoughts on the season as a whole, where it does have interesting moments here and there, but those interesting moments are surrounded by a bevy of boring filler. And with the slow pacing of the episodes, it really makes this feel like a drag. But start off the season with the players in a plane and landing right in front of a box of supplies, and they have to hike to their camp, which takes up a decent chunk of the episode. We do get the setup to some storylines like Nick just sucking at everything, Deb being annoying and not gelling well with her tribe. We get Mad Dog getting winded on the track, and I love Mad Dog as a character. I love, literally the first thing we hear from her is her saying, "Can I pee soon?" Immediately after they pick up their supplies. We do get the start of the Jeff is Sick storyline, which actually is pretty important for the gameplay on the Kucha tribe moving forward. But immediately after they arrive on their camps, we get the iconic scene of Deb yelling out that they could just build a shelter out of rocks. That's pretty fun. We get the start of Scoopin's arc on this season, which, obviously I condemn him for what he's done after Survivor, but on Survivor, Michael Scoopin is a great character. I actually had a lot of fun watching him here on the rewatch. We do also get the start of the Keith and Jerry rivalry here. We get Kimmy being portrayed as a loudmouth, with Deb talking about how she has no filter and Jeff being annoyed by her. Roger gets this weird scene where he talks about using his Bible to start a fire, but then he finds a letter from his son-in-law in that Bible, which just seemed kind of out of left field. And again, if this was modern day Survivor, 100% this would not be allowed, right? Because if it was, this could be very easy to game here. Where, you'd be able to manipulate your tribe by having this fake letter in there and then showing everyone, making them think that you're this really great guy. And then again, luxury items just in general don't really come into play as often anymore. We do then get the immunity challenge, which was a modified version of Quest for Fire, and I found the challenge really boring, but Ogakor wins, and we see some fun moments in the Scramble on Kucha, where Deb targets Jeff because he's sick, and we get this great scene of Jeff telling Alicia that Deb wants to go home, only for her to counter that Deb just told her that Jeff wants to go home. And then we see Jeff's reaction to this. It was pretty fun. I really enjoyed that. But after this, we get the show still pretending that the players actually hike the tribal, with this B-roll of the players climbing over a whole bunch of rocks and stuff, which is really dumb. But we get the tribal, and Deb's obviously the first boot here unanimously. And let's talk about Deb, who I personally feel is more notable for what happened to her post-show and her relationship with the show afterwards. On the actual season, I thought it was pretty clear she was going to be the first boot the entire time. She didn't get that much screen time, though she did have some fun one-liners here and there. I do think she had the ability to play the game. We do see her actively campaigning. We do see her thinking strategically, but I just feel she was someone that never really had much of a shot. And we see her throw Jeff under the bus, but it just didn't seem like she fit in with her tribe, and probably doesn't have the social skills to actually do well on any given season. But now for episode 2, which starts off with another great Scoopin moment of him making rice early in the morning and making it seem like he's doing it for the betterment of the tribe, when it's pretty clear that he's just hungry. And I love how he even messes up when cooking it, where the rice ends up really mushy, and he just pisses off the entire tribe. Speaking of mushy rice on Ogakor, Keith pretty much does the same thing and messes up the rice there, and that leads to Jerry making tortillas out of the rice, and this furthers the storyline of the rivalry between Keith and Jerry. And this is also the first instance of Amber saying, "Oh my god, it's so good," which is like really the most memorable thing from her on this season. Kel, who was invisible in the premiere, gets some screen time here, but really just comes off as a doofus the entire way. And that leads up to the iconic beef jerky gate, where Jerry catches Kel eating something that looks like beef jerky, and I love how awkward Kel is when he tries to explain himself and says that he was just eating a random blade of grass. And I think at this point it's pretty clear that, again, Kel did sneak beef jerky into the game, and this is just him awkwardly trying to lie to cover his tracks. But again, pretty memorable scene there. We do also get the first Tina content in this episode, as she was invisible in the first episode, and the claim is that the editors were trying to hide her in plain sight, and that was a tactic that isn't really used in modern winter edits. And I think a lot of that had to do with obviously Survivor just being a bigger deal back in the day. We do also get another great scoop and scene of him not wanting to be the leader on his tribe, but then constantly catches food and leading a prayer where he talks to God about being looked at as the leader. Like, it's so dumb. It's such a weird scene. But we do have a reward challenge where they have to jump off a cliff, and they make a big deal about Roger not being able to swim, but like this really just doesn't end up mattering. We also have the immunity challenge where the gross food eating comp, and this is kind of iconic for Kimmy being a vegetarian and not wanting to do it. But then she ends up winning it for her tribe because Tina just sucked at it. But then we get to the pre-trial Scramble, and they really try to make it seem like Keith could go home. And we also get the first negative confessional from Colby about Jerry. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's pretty clear Kel is going home. And we do get a really great confessional from Mad Dog where she references a line from the Snakes and Rats speech. But let's talk about Kel. I mean, there isn't much to say. I mean, he's obviously most known for the beef jerky incident, and outside of that, he really brought nothing to the show. And he seemed kind of boring. I mean, the only entertainment from him was just how awkward he was when interacting with his tribe mates, and considering he is this young, fit guy, the fact that he was voted out first on his tribe this early into the history of the show, where the show is so much more focused around challenge strength, I really think that's indicative of just how terrible of a player he really is. Now for episode 3, which continues on with this ridiculous scoop and storyline of him being hungry and he plans to ambush a pig. We get the reward challenge that malfunctioned, and I found it really strange how we actually see it on the show, which is something that they would definitely edit out nowadays. But here we saw like the pole that Scoopin was holding break in half, and instead of trying to find a new pole, they instead ran a tiebreaker race. We then get the first glimpse of the Elizabeth and Roger relationship, which is obviously an iconic relationship from this season, though I personally never found it that interesting, but a lot of people do. We do also see the Alicia and Jeff alliance, who seem to be the ones playing the game the hardest on the Kucha tribe. I mean, we see them try to plan out the entire endgame, that they wanted to get rid of Nick first, which I mean, in my opinion, is a major mistake. I mean, if you're Jeff and Alicia, you need Nick as a number, but whatever. On Ogakor, we get a lot of talk from Jerry, not in a flattering light, but not really that bad. It is kind of sad that this is the type of content that made Jerry become America's most hated person, as it's really nothing in modern day standards. I mean, yes, she is the villain on the show. She is portrayed in a pretty negative light in the sense that like people just found her very annoying, and she was a very domineering personality, but I don't feel like she did much to really earn the ire of America. We do also see the Tina and Mad Dog alliance, which I remember being talked about at the time of how Tina betrayed Mad Dog here. How dare she? But again, like, this is nothing in modern day standards. I mean, Mad Dog was already going home. It's not like Tina was the death sentence for her. But whatever. I mean, we get the immunity challenge where Kucha wins. Mad Dog's a pretty obvious boot here, especially after we hear about a 5-person alliance, including everybody but Mad Dog and Keith. So Mad Dog obviously goes home. But I did find it interesting how here Keith refuses to vote for Mad Dog and votes for Mitchell instead, which is definitely something we'll be talking about in a second. But let's talk about Mad Dog, who I think is a fantastic character through these first few episodes, but kind of like a Sonia from Survivor Borneo, I don't think Mad Dog ever had a shot to make it deep into the game, as she was perceived as the weakest and didn't perform well in challenges. But I do think she left the mark as is. Now for episode 4, which is one of the better episodes of the season, we instantly see Tina and Keith upset at Jerry for how she mentioned everybody but them as her friends at the previous tribal council, and this leads to probably the biggest move of the season. We then get the reward challenge where Kucha wins some chickens, and we get some great Scoopin content again where he wants to eat all the chickens so he can be looked at as the provider once again. And we get this great shot of Scoopin holding a knife while staring at the chickens. Like, that's pretty funny. And even later in the episode, we get Scoopin hunting down the pig, and he's so cocky afterwards about how he feels so comfortable with his position in the tribe after that. And for me, like, on the season, Scoopin's just such a fun, wacky character. The immunity challenge was a quiz, and we just fast forward through most of it, and Kucha ends up winning. And again, there's a lot of interesting strategy on Ogakor here, where Tina has now fully flipped on Jerry, which I did find it interesting how Jerry does pick up on this. I do think her being so paranoid about this might have led to this actually happening, as she directly talks to Colby about this. But then coming into Tribal, Keith and Tina are clearly targeting Mitchell as the weakest member of the tribe. And according to Tina herself, she says a scheme was put together on the way to Tribal, so Colby flips as well. And due to the tiebreaker of previous votes, and Keith, as I mentioned, threw a vote onto Mitchell at the last Tribal, Mitchell ends up getting taken out over Keith. And this is probably the highlight of the season from a game standpoint, as pretty much everything after this, outside the merge boot, is extremely tame. And I also consider this Tina's best move as well. I mean, while she does play the merge particularly well as well, this flips the entire game in her favor, where she becomes the center of the majority of her tribe, where she's closer to Keith and Colby than they are to each other. And if they get the numbers after a merge, which they eventually do, she's just able to run the table without much difficulty. But now let's talk about Mitchell, who was there. I mean, I don't think he really did much of interest on this season. He wasn't a really fun character. He was the prototype for the superfan archetype, where he was cast due to being a massive fan of Survivor Borneo, but no wonder they didn't go back to this archetype for a little while. I mean, he was tall. That was something. That was probably the main reason why he was so boring, though, is because he was so malnutritioned out there, because obviously he's a big guy, he needs a lot to sustain himself, and because he didn't have that, he was probably extremely tired and just didn't have any energy out there. So because of all those things, he just ended up being pretty forgettable for me. Now for episode 5, where not much happens on Ogakor outside of seeing the aftermath of the Mitchell boot, and we get more Jerry content with her being upset at Keith for dumping fish guts, and also Colby being annoyed at her for taking charge on making the stretcher. But on Kucha, though, we get a lot of Kimmy content with her making a big deal out of her not wanting to see the chickens get killed, which really annoys Scoopin. We do also see Scoopin mocking Kimmy about how dirty she is, and this felt like a weird scene. I mean, this would not make the show nowadays. Though really it was just all a setup for the reward challenge where they win cleaning supplies, but even then, Scoopin gets more confessionals to just make fun of Kimmy. But obviously the most memorable Kimmy moment from this episode is her iconic fight with Alicia, which is a lot of fun. Obviously, the "I'll always wave my finger in your face" line is great, and this is probably the most heated fight we've seen in the series up to this point. I do also love how at the beginning of the scene, we do see Jeff Varner just sneak off. I forgot if this is confirmed or not, but obviously it was highly speculated that Jeff Varner was the one that actually instigated this fight. But overall, I mean, this is a great iconic moment for the show. We do also then get the immunity challenge, where Ogakor gets this segment about how much they need to win the challenge, and if they lose, they're pretty much guaranteed to go down one after another after the merge. But they do win, and it's pretty apparent here that Kimmy's going home based on the edit beforehand, but they really do try to make it seem like Roger wants to keep her. And we do see him talk about the vote with Elizabeth and Scoopin, and talking about voting for Alicia, but that doesn't end up going through. I mean, they do vote out Kimmy unanimously, but I do think this tells us what the true power structure in the tribe was. I do think if Scoopin had not fallen in the fire and Kucha did get to the end game, I do think it seems like this trio was the core of the group. I do think, as I mentioned earlier, Alicia and Varner would have mistakenly voted out Nick, and in turn would have been outnumbered in the next 2 rounds, would have gone back to back, and we would have gotten that final 3 of Roger, Elizabeth, and Scoopin. But let's talk about Kimmy, who was one of the better pre-merge characters here, but I am still mind-blown that we did see her return so many years later in Second Chance, but she did have some really memorable moments here. I mean, most of them revolving around her being a vegetarian, and through that she had the gross food eating comp, her refusing to eat chickens, and obviously the iconic fight with Alicia, which was about how Kimmy didn't want to kill the chickens. So really, her being a vegetarian led to so much of the conflict on the Kucha tribe. Gameplay wise, she obviously played terribly. I mean, she was looked at as a nuisance to her camp and, as I said, a source of conflict. And them getting rid of her was really just to benefit the tribe unity moving forward. And while she definitely wasn't my first choice, it was a pleasant surprise to see her back for Cambodia, where she obviously ended up playing a lot better on that season. And I actually wouldn't mind a Kimmy Kappenberg return at this point for a third time, though I don't feel like it's super likely. Now for episode 6, Trial by Fire, one of the most iconic episodes in the history of the show. But outside of the obvious big moment, we do have some other fun scenes like Jerry and Amber talking about chocolate, and Jerry is clearly using this as a metaphor for sex, but like Amber just doesn't pick up on it. And I always just laugh at the point where like Amber just yells out meatball sub. This is also where we get the iconic line from Colby of I ain't no Hershey bar. But something else I did find interesting about this scene was Colby literally right next to them is complaining about them to the camera. And I will say, on the rewatch, I realized how much of a dick Colby is on this season. It's really funny because like obviously America viewed him as this hero. I mean, he was this first like golden boy for Survivor. But he treats people pretty poorly on this season. And another example of that comes from this episode. I mean, on the reward challenge, it was the Blindfold challenge where Jerry was the caller and Ogakor just barely loses. And when they lose, Colby proceeds to chuck a bucket of water at Jerry. And Jerry seems to take it as a joke, but you can clearly tell, like, Colby's actually pissed off. And again, like, Jerry is still portrayed in this episode to be the bad guy, where she gets into an argument with Keith over tomatoes, and both Colby and Tina talk about wanting to take her out. On Kucha, we do get the Kucha corn segment where they cook chicken feed and eat it like popcorn, and there's some fun scooping moments from that. But obviously, we get to the big moment of the episode, probably the biggest moment of the season, where Scoopin falls in the fire. And it's pretty clear they didn't get the shot of him actually falling, but we do see him proceed to run into the water with skin like peeling off his hands. And this is such a big moment for the time. I mean, it was really the first moment of the show to really show how real the elements can be. And while it obviously sucks to see someone injure themselves this bad on the show, it is a great TV moment. We do then cut to Ogakor where they get tree mail and learn about the accident, and we do learn that they will end up merging in the next episode, tied in numbers. But before moving on to the merge, let's talk about Scoopin, who, outside Survivor, is proven to be a terrible human being. But just talking about him within the scope of Survivor, he was a fun character. I thought he was a fun character. He is such a doof on this season, with him just seeming like a lunatic, with him like hunting for a pig and him trying to be the leader without being the leader. He does feel like a prototype for Coach, who is a very similar character in my eyes, though I do feel like Coach is more in on the joke to a degree, while Scoopin is just completely not. I mean, he does obviously return for Survivor Philippines, and I personally am surprised that it did take them that long to bring him back, though obviously he was very notorious for spoiling seasons and claiming he had been called back for like every season. So really, I think his delusions of grandeur really do carry over into real life as well. But again, overall as the TV character during the pre-merge of the season, I thought he was a lot of fun. Now for episode 7, the merge episode, which starts off with the Kuchas talking around the fire about how to approach the merge. And they have this game plan of targeting Colby, which would make sense if they were coming into the merge with the numbers, as he is the most physical of the Ogakors, but having just lost Scoopin, they're now tied. So they should be more so focusing on who they can either flip, which was never happening on this season, especially after how they saw Borneo play out, or more importantly, who they can beat in a tiebreaker, which on this season was previous votes. And really, the Ogakors did have the advantage in this situation and just ran with it, because it is known, and Jeff even talks about it in this scene, that Kimmy did leak to the Ogakors that Jeff had votes on him at the first tribal. So Ogakor already knows who they can target. They just need Kucha to mistakenly target someone without any votes on them, which they do a pretty good job at executing this. And with Colby acting like a dick to make it Kucha think he has votes on him, which, I mean, how much of it was acting? But also Jerry acts on her best behavior to make the Kuchas think she's well liked on the tribe to deter the votes from her. But realistically, I don't think Colby was voted for by the Kuchas because they thought he had votes against him. I mean, Varner talked about this in an interview around the time of Second Chance, that they voted for him as they thought he was the biggest threat. And again, I just don't feel like that was the correct mindset coming into this round. This episode does waste a lot of time on the two tribes coming together, with the men getting together on Kucha and the women getting together on Ogakor, and we see a new camp, and there they get some food, not as much as we would see in a modern merge feast. I mean, they only got like fruit, cheese, and crackers. But I mean, overall, I did find this portion of the episode pretty boring. We do get the endurance challenge, which was the perch, which they never do nowadays, as this is an endurance comp that went on for 10 hours, and they don't want that because that messes with the production schedule. But Jeff does bring out some foods as temptations, and Varner drops out for peanut butter, which is really dumb, again, as he even says himself earlier in the episode, he knows he's going to be the target because he has votes on him. So why was he so ready to drop at almost the first opportunity? But we get 10 hours in, where Alicia finally drops for coffee and chocolate, leaving Tina and Keith. And I love how Tina throws the comp here to Keith, as Keith is Ogakor's biggest weakness, as he's the one with the most votes on him. And that just leaves Jerry as the only person that has votes against them on their tribe, and this greatly increases their chance at the vote. And we go straight to tribal after this, where the votes play out as expected. Kucha vote for Colby, Ogakor vote for Jeff. And I found it interesting how Colby says that this was a strategic decision decided the first week. And I think that makes it even more clear that the Kimmy story is true. But we get the revote, which right before that, we get one of my favorite Colby lines in I only know how to play this game one way, and that's full tilt. But we get to the tiebreaker, where Jeff goes home because he has one vote that he knows of. Technically he has two, but whatever. While Colby has no votes, which, by the way, I mean, isn't this kind of dumb too, that this is a point in Survivor where they didn't necessarily show all the votes. Now in modern Survivor they do. But back in the day, when it was actually important that they showed all the votes, they for some reason didn't show all the votes. Like, I don't know what was going on. Because, like, again, this could be pretty important. Like, if the Cooches had voted someone, that person had, like, 2 votes against them, but Jeff, who really had 2, but then, like, he was saying, oh, one that I know of. It's like, would that have really been the deciding factor there? I mean, obviously not. But still, it's a really dumb aspect here. That would be production that would have to step in and say, like, hey, you actually got 2 votes. Let's talk about Varner, who, again, is another really problematic figure nowadays in Survivor. But again, in the context of this season, I thought he was really fun. I mean, he fits kind of the same mold as like a Richard Hatch on the first season, where he's this really strategically savvy, snarky personality. And he was one that I was really excited to see come back for Second Chance. But here, I did like his confessionals. He was a bit cocky at points. I don't think he really lived up to his potential, partially due to him being sick, but also due to him probably think he was in a better position than what he really was. I mean, I do believe that Scoopin sides with Roger and Elizabeth. However, Scoopin out of the game, Team Austin was probably better positioned in that case. But still, I think the Cooches just messed up their entire strategy coming into the merge, and I do think Jeff is probably a major reason for that. Overall, I did like Jeff on the season, and I know if I were to watch this season live, he would probably be the person I would be rooting for. Now for episode 8, which was a pretty slow episode, we do see some of the aftermath from the Jeff vote with how the Cooches know that they're screwed, and Alicia talking about how the Ogakors need to treat them nice because the Cooches are going to decide the winner, which doesn't end up happening as they end up splitting their votes anyway. But we then see Tina talk about something that does become pretty prominent later on, and that is Tina wants the good people to win, which I do think is a reaction to seeing Rich win Borneo, but you can clearly see this in Tina's gameplay moving forward, where at every opportunity where it's not strategically insane to do so, she tries to take out the people that she considers undeserving. But it seems pretty clear that the other players know this about her as well, where like Jerry is worried that Tina would blindside her for this reason, which brings me to this strategic gaffe in this season of both Jerry and Amber not flipping to the Cooches, which, I mean, obviously you have to blame the Cooches as well. Like, what are the Cooches doing here? Like, I really don't get it, where the obviously strategic move here is for the Cooches to get Jerry and Amber to flip on the core 3, and I get that no one liked Jerry out there, and we do see Elizabeth and the Cooches putting their votes on Jerry, banking on the fact that Tina is going to flip on her. But why not bank on Jerry flipping on Tina instead, which would have been a more likely option, and one that would have given them back control of the game. You get a boomerang competition for a war challenge, which I thought was pretty fun, and Jerry wins it and takes Amber with her, which I don't think is the correct strategic move for her either, as if she's worried about being on the out, she should bring one of the core members of the group, or bring along a Kucha member so that she could flip, but instead she brings along Amber, who she was already aligned with anyway. But we get to the immunity challenge where Keith wins, and there really just isn't much intrigue going in the tribal, as it makes no sense for the core Ogre cores to flip on Jerry just yet, so we do see Alicia go home in a 5-4 vote. And I thought Alicia was fun on this season as well. I do think she is one of the bigger gamers on the Kucha tribe, where we do see her teaming up with Varner, and she was pretty iconic on this season as well with her fight with Kimmy. And overall, Alicia is pretty likable on this season, probably more so than I remembered. I mean, she obviously does come back for All Stars, which wasn't as memorable of a run for her, and also probably not as likable of a run for her, despite her making it further. But I do think she had a decent run on this season. Now, episode 9 was a clip show, and I'll be honest, I didn't bother watching it, so we're going to skip it and jump into episode 10, which starts off with a lot of camp life, of how the water's muddy and how they're running out of rice. But we do get some drama from the reward challenge, where Jerry wants to pick Colby as her pair, but everyone else wants to make it fair by making it a random draw, where Jerry ends up with Colby anyway, and does end up winning the reward, which is a visit to the Great Barrier Reef. And this scene of them getting ready at camp and getting onto the helicopter is just so drawn out. It really feels like they had nothing else to show for this episode. And a lot of the trip itself is just Jerry talking about how this is the perfect honeymoon without the sex, and Colby just seems to hate her the entire time. And we get back to camp, where Colby does hand out coral, and this was a massive controversy, as it was actually illegal for Colby to take coral from the reef. And this led to a massive fine that production had to end up paying off, and really wasn't a great look for the show. But it does lead to a pretty interesting Jerry confessional, where she reveals that her plan is to go to the final 2 with Colby, as she thinks she has a chance against him. And again, I do feel like this further supports this thought that Colby was just kind of a dick while he was out there. But after this, we do get Nick finally getting some content about how he's the biggest threat coming into the immunity, and he does end up winning a tug-of-war tournament. And with Nick off the board, I do think this is what convinces Tina and Keith to just say screw it and take Jerry out, as I think it's pretty clear they really liked Elizabeth and Roger, wanted to keep them around as long as possible, as again, they considered them the good people. And while I do think she was willing to vote out Nick over Jerry, I do think once Nick is obviously safe, Jerry was the obvious boot for them, as they still retained the numbers after this, at least theoretically. However, I don't think this was the correct strategic move, but we'll talk about that in a second. But I did also find it interesting that despite Colby going along with the Jerry boot and seeming to be pretty happy when he votes her out, he's actually shown to not be pro the move pre-tribal. I mean, he seems to actually be trying to convince Tina to not do it, which, I mean, I do think is the correct strategic move. But whatever happens anyway, Jerry goes home in a 6-2 vote. And again, let's talk about Jerry, who is obviously one of the most iconic characters from this season. I mean, she was looked at as the first massive female villain for the show, and despite the fact that I don't feel like that was warranted, as again, I don't think she did anything bad on this season, or at least nothing to what we would see from villains later on. I mean, just think about Russell Williams. But we do see that she is bossy, and she does get on people's nerves, but I don't get the absolute hostility that America had for her at the time. Gameplay-wise, I do think she had a pretty strong mind for the game here. I mean, she did put together the initial majority alliance, but due to her personality, she wasn't able to hold it together, as obviously Tina and Colby flipped on her, with a lot of that being just because they didn't like her. And I do think once that happened, she could have been more active to try to get on the good side of the Kuchas and see if she could play on that side. But I think also considering how early we are in the series, once that Mitchell boot happens, I do think she was pretty screwed, and I don't think she really had much chance moving forward. Now for episode 11, where we see Amber being upset about Jerry's blind side. And again, if this was Modern Survivor, I do think the Ogre made a massive mistake here, as it makes no sense for Amber to not flip on the Ogre here, especially since they just blindsided her. I mean, she is clearly on the bottom of her group, and the Kuchas seem willing to pick her up for this one vote. Though, by the time we get to Tribal, we do see Elizabeth and Roger vote for Amber, so I'm unsure on whose end the fault really goes to here. I don't know if it was the Kuchas who didn't want to work with Amber, or was it Amber that told the Kuchas she wasn't going to vote with them. I mean, really, this is just a classic case of the minority not being able to get their act together to flip on the core group. But in terms of the episode, I mean, we do get a long segment of the players talking about how they have no food and them hunting for bugs. But this does lead up to the first ever Survivor auction, which to me is really funny in retrospect, with literally the first item being literally a few Doritos and salsa. I mean, that just seems so pathetic. Amber ends up spending $80 on a can of Mountain Dew. I mean, Nick gets 3 crackers for $120. Again, there's some really, really ridiculous items here. I mean, it really just shows how stingy production was. But we do also see Elizabeth and Tina pool money to buy a meal, which is later outruled, I'm assuming due to how unfair it would be in situations where game advantages are in play, as obviously that would give the majority such an advantage in that situation. But overall, I mean, this was a really interesting auction to watch, as it was the first one, but I mean, at the end of the day, though, it is kind of forgettable. After this, we do get another Nick is lazy segment, and how he's conserving his energy for the immunity challenge, which he ends up losing anyway to Colby. And this is Colby's first win. He does end up winning the last 5 immunity challenges of the season. He wins every challenge from this point forward, outside of one, and that one was out of his control anyway. And because of this, Colby gets a lot of credit as being this challenge beast. But in reality, if you look at the challenges that he won, they were all pretty tame physically. I mean, they're radically different from the challenges that we see him suck on in Heroes vs. Villains, get ridiculed for not being good at. I mean, the immunity challenges that he wins here are a fire making challenge, a slingshot challenge, the folklore challenge, a matching memory game, and fallen comrades. Again, most of these are more mental comps than they are ones involving any real physicality. Plus also the fact that if we look at his competition, I mean, he spent a lot of the endgame competing against Keith, Tina, Roger, and Elizabeth, who aren't good at challenges by any means. Really, once Nick goes, that was really his biggest competitor in challenges. So really, I don't think Colby is the challenge beast that a lot of people believed him to be this early on in the series. But we then get the follow-up scene. to the scene from earlier, where they were out of food, where we see Jeff arrive at camp with rice. And I did find it funny how even this early in the show, he's like berating them for running out of rice. But I do think he kind of let them off kind of easy. I mean, in San Juan del Sur, we see Jeff ask for every single reward that the tribe has won. But here, he only asks for the tarps, plus Colby's flag. Which I also love how Jeff like calls Colby out for his flag, like being engineered as a tarp. But the rest of the episode is kind of boring. I mean, we do see Colby being worried that Amber's going to flip. But again, it was never a realistic possibility on the episode. So Nick goes home, and again, Nick was a non-factor. I mean, he wasn't given much screen time on the season, and when he was, it was largely about how lazy he is. He seemed like a really intelligent person, but just like most players in this old school landscape of Survivor, he wasn't really playing the game optimally, and he seemed to be pretty much resigned to his fate after Kucha lost control and banked on winning challenges to get to the end, which was never going to work. But overall, for me, I mean, he is one of the more forgettable figures on the season. Now for episode 12, which is one of the most survival-centric episodes in the history of the show, and we get more talk about the food situation, followed by a segment about how Amber's weak, and this is really the only indication that the show gives to why she ends up going home this episode, which I just found weird. But we do get the reward challenge where Colby wins a trip to a cattle farm, and I also found it weird how he didn't get the choice to pick anyone to bring with him. It was just literally just him. It was really just surreal to see him like sitting around the campfire with a bunch of cowboys eating beans. And then we get to what takes up the majority of the episode, and that is the camp getting flooded. And we get this segment at night where like Keith is trying to cross the current to get their rice back, which is floated away, and that they just gave up all their tarps to get. And I did find it funny how like Tina's just able to swim across before he's even able to get to it, which again just shows how much Keith kind of sucks. But this is also a pretty memorable scene from the season. We do get the immunity challenge where Colby wins, and we get the tribal where inexplicitly Amber goes home and afforded to vote with Colby voting with her. But again, the show gives no explanation for this. I mean, obviously, like, looking back on it, it's obviously more of this Tina and Keith mindset of keeping the good people around. And they're at the point now where they 100% don't need Amber in the game. So why not take her out? But at the same time, I do feel like Amber was less of a jury threat than both Roger and Elizabeth. So I don't think it was the ideal move to make. But again, I do think that was their mindset. Let's talk about Amber, who was another one of the non-factors on this season, which is kind of ironic considering her legacy on the show now, where she's obviously brought back for All-Stars, wins All-Stars, and then comes back for Winners at War. But really on this initial run, she really didn't do much. I mean, it was widely known that she wasn't one of the top picks for All-Stars, and she was only cast due to Elizabeth turning it down, and it would be really interesting to see how Survivor history changes if that hadn't been the case, is obviously that would have a major ripple effect on Survivor history and also even Amazing Race history. And Boston Rob would have a radically different legacy on the show. But I mean, overall in this season, as a character and a player, she is pretty unmemorable, and she didn't really play the game at all. And for me, she's still probably the most questionable choice for the cast of Survivor All-Stars. Now for episode 13, and while the show was already pretty boring for the last few episodes, this is really my breaking point, where from this point on, this season is insufferable. It is so boring. And in this episode, we do get the family reward, which in this season involved being able to text chat their loved ones from home. And this is so awkward, where I guess production sent crews to these families' homes and recorded them writing back to their players. And this entire scene is just so bizarre to watch, especially because the actual reward challenge ends up being that the family members have to do this survival quiz, and Tina's family ends up winning the challenge. And we do get a teenage Katie Collins sighting here, which I thought was pretty fun. But before and after the challenge, I mean, each of the players get a short chat with their loved ones as well. And for the most part, it was pretty boring, though there was some intrigue here, like Colby's mom just wasting her message by saying hi baby, which I found funny, and then like Colby like breaking down from that. And also we get like Keith proposing to his girlfriend, which really felt like he was just doing it for the publicity, and this was just such an awkward thing to do over text. But I did like how Jeff seemed genuinely happy for Keith at the time, probably the happiest I've ever seen Jeff on the show. After this, though, we do get a Keith is annoying segment with Elizabeth being upset over how he's rationing the rice, and we do see him get into an argument with Colby, and Colby calling him a bozo and talking about how he doesn't deserve to win the game. We do get the folklore challenge that isn't nearly as fun as last season's, where Rudy was just saying, I don't know, but Colby wins, and we do see Roger tell the Ogakors to vote him out over Elizabeth as she needs the money more, and we go to Tribal, and that happens. So let's talk about Roger, who I thought was a pretty likable presence on this season. I did enjoy watching his relationship with Elizabeth to a degree. I mean, obviously it's not the most scintillating TV, but I mean, it is a heartwarming sort of relationship to see, especially because like Roger ends up giving up his game for her at the end. Though I did kind of find it funny how he gives up his game for her because Elizabeth needs the money, when I'm pretty sure that's not really the case not too long after the season actually ends. But I really did see Roger as someone who understood the game but wasn't willing to play the game due to his morals and the way that he perceived that the game should be played. Like, I don't think he has the worst strategic mind for the game, it's just he's not willing to actually use it. Though now, with obviously the game having changed, time has passed, I wouldn't mind seeing a return from Roger at some point in Survivor history, though obviously now it's very, very unlikely. Now for episode 14, the penultimate episode of the season, and why is this still going? How is this not the finale? And really, a lot of this episode encompasses Colby and his reward. I mean, he starts the episode talking about how he misses his mom, and that leads us right to the reward challenge where Colby wins the second chance competition. And I always liked this comp, I mean, where it's an obstacle course comprised of elements from previous challenges, and this is something they did pretty often in older seasons, but they don't really do it anymore. I really wish they would come back to it because, again, I really enjoy it. But this was also the first car reward, and this does start the car curse, where obviously Colby wins the car and doesn't end up winning the season. After this, we do get the players getting a scale and mirror, which, whatever. Again, just felt like the producers knew they had no content for this episode and just threw this in there to have something to show. But then we get Jeff arriving with his car warming gift, and we get this segment with Colby obviously talking about how great the car is, but this is followed by Jeff and Colby being served food, and guess what? The waitress is his mom. This entire family visit is just so weird, with like Colby comparing it to like a conjugal visit, but outside of this, the episode is so unremarkable, where Colby wins immunity again and Elizabeth goes out without much of a fight. And Elizabeth was pretty likable on this season, getting not much gameplay to her here, just like most of the other Coochas, but I do think if Scoopin had not been medevaced, I do think she was in a decent position to win. Again, if the 6 Coochas were the final 6, Nick goes out first, as I mentioned before, and I do think Scoopin sides with Roger and Elizabeth, so once they get to 3, if Scoopin doesn't win immunity, he does go home at 3, and Roger more than likely lays down his game for Elizabeth, and Elizabeth would win that scenario. Mind you, she would be in danger if Scoopin did win final immunity, where I do think he takes Roger, but that's besides the point. I do think Elizabeth would have been in a decent position to win if the Coochas had gone to the end with the numbers, but overall of how the season played out, I mean, she was still a likable presence, despite the legacy that she's probably left behind due to what she's done post-show. Now for the finale, and what a boring episode this is. I will say this now, this is probably the worst episode in Survivor history for me. I hate this episode. And we literally have a 2-hour episode just to do the final 3 immunity challenge, which is immediately followed by the vote out. And then we get final tribal. I mean, this could have been done in like 30 minutes or less, but instead we get a ridiculous amount of filler. And we get so many confessionals throughout the episode with the players just talking about how they've evolved over the course of the game. We get an arts and crafts segment for like no reason. We get the rites of passage, which is really boring on this season because there's no narration or confessionals, so it's just a really long, boring montage. They then meet up with Jeff on the top of the waterfall and partake in a ritual of reflection. It's like, isn't that what this entire episode has been to this point? It's like, why do we need more reflection? But they finally arrive at Tribal, where they have Fallen Comrades as the final immunity challenge, which is, again, I love as a challenge as it tests the social skills of the player and how much they got to know the other players out there. Though I don't love it for a final immunity challenge, as it does make it feel kind of anticlimactic, but Colby does win and unsurprisingly votes out Keith. Now let's talk about Keith, who is an interesting player to me on this rewatch. I mean, he really was the first GOAT in Survivor history, though he was dragged along only to be cut at the end instead of actually be taken to the end. He annoyed a lot of his fellow castaways and would have lost against pretty much anybody at the end. As a character, he did have his moments here and there, but I did feel like his better moments were in conjunction with the conflicts he would have with better characters like Jerry and Colby. I mean, he was fine on the show for his individual season, but I can't really see him being too interesting on a return or really just any other season that he doesn't have these conflicts. But now we have the final 2, and I love how Tina talks about how she was just dragging Keith along the entire time. But we do get a lot more filler after this of the two like sitting on a rock and talking about their experience once again. But I did find it interesting that Colby explicitly says that Tina played a better game than him. And I do think Colby was playing to become a superstar more so than he was to play the game. I mean, he wanted to look like the good guy more than he wanted the $1 million. And to be honest, it probably was the better option for him financially, as he did end up doing some acting and some hosting after the show. That probably did make him more than the $1 million that he would have gotten from the show. But eventually get the Tribal, where it was pretty tame, especially in comparison to Borneo's. I do feel like both of their final tribal performances were pretty weak, with Tina being really dismissive of the jury by like telling them to not vote because your feelings got hurt. And we have Colby just being really curt with his answers and not even saying any final words. I mean, none of the jury questions really stand out either. I mean, Roger talks about morals and ethics. Amber wants to know what they'll do with the money. And really, it's a lot of stuff that I just don't care about. I mean, Elizabeth wants to know which 2 people they don't want to get the money, and I don't get why Colby answered Jerry, as I do think that was a terrible move for him if he wanted to get Jerry's vote, especially after Tina also answered Jerry. But eventually we get to the votes and we see Roger and Amber voting for Colby while Alicia and Jerry vote for Tina, and I don't understand why they showed Alicia and Jerry's vote. It's like, doesn't that just spoil that Tina won? I mean, weren't like Elizabeth and Keith the 2 more locked votes for Tina? It's like, why didn't they show their votes? It just felt really strange to me, especially because they were setting up Jerry to be the swing vote the entire time. But we get to a live show and we waste more time with Jeff asking the players questions, but eventually the votes are revealed and Tina does win the game in a 4-3 vote. And I just love how Colby freaks out and cheers in this ridiculous manner that really made it feel like he was just trying to make himself look like the good guy again. And I did also find it funny how immediately after the votes revealed, while everybody's hugging, we see Jeff just walk over to the side and snuff Colby's torch, which again is something that they don't do nowadays. But that's pretty much the season. I mean, again, a really boring finale for me outside of the actual results themselves. But before we end the video, we should talk about the final 2. And let's start with Colby, who I still love as a character on this season, but I will say that my opinion of him as a player probably went down here after rewatching this. I mean, there's a lot of points in the season that lead me to think that his social game was very poor on the island. I do think Tina just outplays him strategically during the game. I mean, obviously outside of challenge performance, I do think Colby, obviously he was really good at challenges, but again, like, we have to look at the field and also the type of challenges he was given. But I mean, something about Colby that I do find interesting is that obviously Colby knew what he needed to do to win the game. He knows he wins against Keith, but due to outside circumstances of him wanting to become a star, I do think he was unwilling to do that. But despite those things, he's still a great character, and it is really fun to watch him on this season, especially for snarky confessionals. And now for the winner, I mean, Tina, not much of my opinions have changed, really, on Tina. I had already come around to Tina being the better player of the two before this rewatch, because there was a point in time where I did think Colby should have won, or I did think Colby was the better player, but I do think in retrospect, Tina was definitely more in charge of the decision-making for that group, and did have more control in the major flip that happened. That did benefit Tina way more than did Colby. I mean, Colby really sabotages his game multiple times to give Tina the win, obviously with the final vote where he votes out Keith, but also voting out Jerry is something that is very detrimental for Colby's game as well. As a character, though, I mean, she's fine. I mean, I don't like her notion of the good people need to win. I don't think she had as many memorable moments as like a Colby or a Jerry, but she obviously does return 2 more times after this, with neither of those runs being nearly as impressive as her run here, but in my opinion, I do still think it's a travesty that she wasn't on Winners at War. But that's pretty much all I have to say about Survivor, the Australian Outback. Again, a season that I don't particularly like. I mean, this is easily my least favorite season of the show. The back half of the season is the worst stretch of episodes in the show's history. The finale is one of the worst episodes in the history of the show. I really don't like this season. This rewatch did nothing to change my opinion on that. And if anything, it further cemented this opinion. I just don't like how this season played out. I don't like how this season is portrayed. I don't like the things that they focus on. The things that they focus on are things that I just personally don't care about. Again, that's just me. I know other people love this season. Good on you. But for me personally, I really just can't get into it. And really, it doesn't have to do with it being old school Survivor, because like I personally love Africa. I love Marquesas. I even like Borneo. While they're all still bottom half seasons for me in my season ranking, I still really enjoy watching those seasons. Just Australian Outback for me is just such a drag, which part of that has to do with the fact that they added more episodes to really bloat the season out. Plus also they added more days, and there just wasn't much going on within the season itself. So really for me, Australian Outback has to be my least favorite season of the show. Now, like Survivor Borneo, I will probably be doing a player ranking for this season down the line, so stay tuned for that. I'll be doing a retrospective similar to this for Survivor Africa as well, once we get to the 20th anniversary of that season later in the year. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.